Welcome to our webinar, Is Cushing's a Death Sentence for Your Horse? With Dr. Joyce Harman. Today's webinar is brought to you by Dox Hemp. Hemp with CBD that can support your horse's immune system and keep him or her calm and relaxed. Dox Hemp is veterinary approved. Available in liquid or powder. Dox Hemp, your leading source of CBD for horses and pets. Now here's your host, Stephanie Bradley.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our Wednesday webinar with holistic veterinarian Dr. Joyce Harman, sponsored by Dox Hemp. A little housekeeping first. Please mute your microphones, and if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box and we will answer them at the end. Let's get started. Welcome, Joyce.
Welcome, Steph. This is a topic that is near and dear, certainly to my heart, because I have one of these guys sitting out in my pasture, and Steph's got a couple sitting out in her pasture. So hopefully we can shed a little bit of light on this whole Cushing's, PPID, what does it all mean, kind of get some answers tonight.
Yeah, let's get started with what is it?
So we'll first do some science, and you know, I like to try and show people what's actually going on behind the scenes inside the body so that you can actually understand what the real issues are. And then we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty a little bit later on, and then how we can go about actually treating it. So we talk about Cushing's and we talk about the pituitary gland, but what are we really talking about? The pituitary gland is this little tiny thing in the brain, and the part of the pituitary gland that gives us grief is the pars intermedia. So there's 3 different lobes in the pituitary gland, and the intermediate part, or the middle part, is the primary part of the gland that is responsible. So in reality, we've been calling things Cushing's for 20 years, but the most accurate name is pituitary pars intermedia dysfunction, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that's the case. So you'll probably hear me slip in the word Cushing's, and you'll probably hear Steph slip in the word Cushing's periodically, because for 20 years, that's what we've been calling it. And so really, to be scientifically accurate, we should be calling it PPID. We certainly don't want to run around saying pituitary pars intermedia dysfunction. That's way too much to say. So PPID works, and it is an accurate term. So what does the pars intermedia do? This is just a tiny little description of everything that goes on. The intermediate lobe produces this ACTH. So when you get your blood test back, you see ACTH. ACTH means adrenocorticotropic hormone. ACTH, again, is much easier to say, and that is a correct correct definition of it. The dysfunction aspect is that ACTH regulation decreases. So what happens in the body is that everything is regulating everything else, and in this dysfunctional state, the regulation is no longer happening. So we end up with excess ACTH, which goes to the adrenal gland, and it tells it to produce more cortisol, or internal body cortisone. The dopamine is another brain chemical that decreases as this dysfunction happens. And so the dopamine normally is that regulator of the ACTH. So when the dopamine decreases, then the ACTH increases. And then the ACTH causes more cortisol or cortisone to be produced. So there's many reasons, and we'll talk about the reasons why this can happen. But you have the dopamine working on the ACTH, and then you lose your dopamine control. So that may only be clear as mud, of which we have plenty of here on the East Coast. But that's the beginning of understanding the complexity of it. This is not a simple thing. I think I saw somebody kind of raising their hand. The best thing to do is to type your question into the chat box so we can incorporate it. So why does this occur? There are a whole lot of reasons, and I'm just going to try and break it down to a fairly simple description, knowing that you could write an entire PhD thesis on this. So oxidative stress is one of the biggest contributors to the damage that's occurring in the pituitary gland.
And Joyce, what is oxidative stress?
So oxidative stress, think about it like rust. So we talk about taking antioxidants everywhere you look these days in the news and on the TV and in all of your health literature. It says we need to take antioxidants. Antioxidants are basically anti-rust ingredients, anti-rust compounds. Oxidation is basically rust. Well, our cells don't rust because they're not made out of metal, but it is the same concept. Rust breaks down and destroys metal, particularly iron. So oxidative stress, if you think about it like rust breaking down parts of our body, that's the easiest way to understand how this gets started. So oxidative stress can happen for so many reasons. And in that process, as we lose control, we have this ACTH allowing our cortisol levels to increase. Our cortisol is our fight and flight hormone. And so if we go into fight or flight mode, we need extra fuel for the body to react to flight. So if you have to run away from a predator, all of a sudden you need way more fuel than you normally do. So the cortisol triggers the increase in glucose, and it will do that any way that it can. So it can break down protein, it can break down amino acids, it can break down fat, but it usually is going to break down whatever is there first. The problem is that fight or flight is over shortly. You either get eaten or you escape. And once you've escaped, you're okay. And if you're eaten, cortisol doesn't matter anymore. So when this ACTH is triggering the cortisol levels all the time, this process is going on all the time. So then our pancreas comes into play, and the pancreas is responsible for secreting insulin. And this is part of, we're not going to talk a lot about insulin resistance tonight, but because I've got some other webinars on that. But there is a lot of tie-in between PPID and insulin resistance because we are stimulating the pancreas because we now have a whole bunch of glucose in the cell. So there'll be a quiz at the end, okay? So you better be taking good notes.
And
Uh,
Joyce,
yeah.
I'm curious, thinking of the insulin resistance, are all, if you've got Cushing's, do you definitely have insulin resistance?
Not necessarily. So all of these things tie together, but some horses will become insulin resistant and never show this high ACTH, never have a dysfunctional pituitary. Other horses will have just a dysfunctional pituitary and no insulin resistance, and some get both. Many get both because of this relationship here. But if they have a good, strong, healthy insulin system, then they don't actually become resistant to it.
Okay.
And if they happen to have a good, strong pituitary gland, they may only become insulin resistant. So any or all of the above can occur, but it doesn't mean that your horse has both. They don't necessarily. So our pancreas and insulin, one of the jobs of insulin is to carry the excess energy, the excess glucose to the muscle cell so that you can run away from the mountain lion. Well, when the mountain lion isn't there and you're doing this every day, the insulin has to take all that extra glucose put it somewhere. So guess what? It stores it as fat. Whoops. So that's where you see your more insulin resistant creatures. And that energy gets stored as fat, even in some of the horses with just PPID. What's interesting is that the more they study fat, they realize that fat is actually an organ by itself, and it also can create inflammation and become very inflammatory. So think about that hard fat pads that you have on your horse, or the big hard crest. That's inflamed fat. Well, guess what that inflammation is doing? Creating more oxidative stress because it's not healthy. So we go right back to the beginning where our oxidative stress is one of the primary contributors. So we have a big circle here, back and forth and all around. And that's why we have this sphere here. So the easiest way to look at it is that that little tiny pituitary gland is the grandma to the whole hormonal system. And you can kind of think about like your little pony Steph, who's the grandma of everybody and bosses everybody around, even if they're 16 hands tall. This pituitary gland is the grandma to the whole hormonal system. And we have hormones of all different types in the body. We have also hundreds of hormones that most of us have never ever heard of, that are very small compounds not talked about frequently. We're talking about the common ones here with insulin and cortisol and ACTH. And so in a perfect system, all of these hormones are in balance with each other, with that pituitary gland kind of overseeing what's happening in the body. So if the pituitary gland gets old, when grandma gets old, what happens? She doesn't oversee the household as well as she used to. So we get some little lumps and bumps into our perfect sphere. And that's when things start falling apart. And you get the inflammation, you actually get inflammation in the pituitary gland. You get hyperplasia, which is just some abnormal growth of the pituitary gland. I have a cat helping me here. And so any part of that pituitary gland can be affected more in one horse than in another horse. We know that stress affects the amount of cortisol in the body as well, because cortisol is our stress hormone. So when stress is occurring in life, not just in the ACTH end of things, so we have our internal kind of stress, but we also have external stress. And so you start that whole circle over again. And we lose this perfect sphere.
And Joyce, do you find like more males or more females, just thinking of that hormonal balance?
Well, actually, we have a lot of hormones. We have girls have hormones, boys have hormones. Most of the time, we have removed the testicles from our geldings, and we don't have testosterone. But that's the only hormone that's missing in the males. So all the rest of that hormonal system is still present in the males. And all those hundreds of minor hormones are also present in the male. So really the only thing they're missing is the testosterone, but they've got everything else. So you will see PPID in mares and in geldings. And some different studies, sometimes they'll show more mares or more geldings in a setting, but overall you have it in both.
Okay.
So the big question, is there a tumor? Because that's what we get told. And it's not quite as bad these days because I think we have a better understanding of PPID, but still we get told a lot that it's a tumor in the pituitary gland. Most of the time it is not. It's the cells, if they look at them under a microscope, they call it hyperplasia. And the hyperplasia means nothing more than enlarged and different, not normal. And we don't have to get into the absolute histology and science of that. But it usually is the dysfunction. And that's why PPID, with the D for dysfunction, really is the correct term. Because it's not a tumor, it's just a dysfunctional grandma. And we probably have had a few of those in our households over the years. So if you have some of these refractory cases that just don't get better despite everything you do, potentially those are the ones that have tumors. And I certainly have horses that I give them the things that I know most horses respond to, and they just do not respond. They continue to get worse. You can give them drugs, you can give them herbs, you can give them everything. Nothing much happens. Those ones probably are a tumor. We cannot image that tumor unless you did maybe an MRI, you might be able to see it. So we don't necessarily know, but we know that we have a horse that's not responding. So basically put tumor out of your vocabulary and think of it as a dysfunction. So one of the big things that helps create this, because you can say, okay, I've had horses all my life and I'm not young anymore. And we didn't see all of this when I was young. If you look at the life that our horses lead these days, and it's not necessarily the life they lead in your barn. Your barn may be wonderful and they have friends and they have paddock turnout and they have all the comforts of home. But most of us didn't breed and raise our horses. And so most of these horses that we have acquired have been through other lives. Some of those other lives have been very stressful. Some of those other lives have been horrendous. And some of those other lives have had some of the other issues that we'll talk about in a minute. But stress is a big one. So competition horses, they are under stress. Their cortisol levels are high often. Even if they enjoy showing, it's still a stress, just as it is a stress for you to get ready to go to the show and to come home. Training can be stressful depending on how it's done. And if you adopt a horse, say out of the quarter horse pleasure industry, those horses are under a tremendous amount of stress, but so are the higher level competition horses in almost every sport. And almost every sport can also be done without that high stress. But very often we inherit horses that have been through high stress. And a lot of the people that are actually going to be listening to this webinar are people who have adopted horses or purchased horses out of difficult situations in order to help them out. So that background is stressful. Lack of company. Horses are herd animals. So confinement. This picture comes from Hong Kong. It's so hot in Hong Kong, it doesn't cool off at night. They live in air-conditioned barns. So there is no contact with other horses. They see other horses walk by and that's about it. A lot of horses, even not in Hong Kong, live in basically solitary confinement in small paddocks without real interaction with other horses. Exercise can be irregular for a whole variety of reasons. Ask me if I've been riding my horse regularly. And through the years, you know, sometimes we just can't get it done because life in the modern age is busy. And we have chronic pain, which is a source of stress.
And Joyce, I do have a question there. So is stress causing the gland to deteriorate or?
Stress, that's a good question. Stress itself, if we go back to our cortisol issue, so stress increases the cortisol.
Okay, that's right.
Yes, and so you have that higher level of cortisol sitting there all the time from the stress. And so there's a forward feedback system around this sphere, and there's a reverse feedback system. So we have too much cortisol out here in the body. Poor grandma gets worn out trying to regulate that up here in the brain. And so you have the feedback coming from the horse show stress or the physical stress feeding back to grandma, as well as once grandma starts to fail, grandma not controlling and balancing the cortisol. And so you can come into that circle. That's why I represent it as a sphere, because you can enter it anywhere from any angle and have an effect on the whole sphere, on all the hormones, because you're affecting one little spot.
Great, thanks.
We create internal metabolic stress with drugs, with over vaccination. And we're not going to get into all that, though we do have some interesting webinars coming up. This will be kind of a long one. We've got some short ones coming up. So stay tuned because we'll have lots more topics. But giving lots of drugs have to be detoxified. Drugs have effects on the body. They have side effects on the body. And many times we get caught up in more and more and more medicine. The body is under some degree of stress. Our fly sprays, and really this holds true for our chemicals, our herbicides, our pesticides, our pyrethroid fly sprays. They have hormonal action. Many of our herbicides and pesticides are estrogenic in nature. So we're entering that circle from the estrogen point and having an effect on that and changing the natural body estrogen effects. So the problem with fly sprays with horses is that a lot of times we put them in overhead systems. And so they're sprayed continually onto the horse's food and into the water. We also put them on topically. And many of the toxicity studies that say, well, this stuff's really not very toxic, are done on concentrations of around 1%. A lot of our topicals are 15 to 44%, maybe even higher these days. Haven't looked at one recently. And then, of course, genetics. And that's another way to affect this system. So this can run in families. Probably 70 or 80% of us don't know what our horse's family history is. We do not know what either the stallion or the mare was like, what genes they had, how they were handled. And we have lots of horses that are thrifty. Easy keepers, which is the worst word in the world, because
Yes, it
an
is.
easy keeper is a halfway thin thoroughbred that you can turn out on a 50-acre field of grass. An easy keeper is you're trying to monitor every blade of grass they get into them, and you're struggling all the time to control that. So this really doesn't help us. But many of the breeds we like are very, very efficient, and they come from parts of the world where there's not a lot of food. And so they are thrifty. They don't need much food. And we come along and feed them. And a lot of times, again, we don't know how they were fed as babies, but we know from the research that feeding babies, human babies, animal babies, whatever, can trigger insulin resistance, PPID tendencies from very young ages, because you're coming in, we talked about stress coming in and hitting the cortisol part of that sphere. Well, the genetics part comes in and comes over here and maybe hits the insulin part. Maybe they're very sensitive to insulin. So a lot of the Andalusians, a lot of our Morgans, a lot of our ponies, if you look at where they live, they don't need anything to eat. And then we turn them out on a field of grass, or we feed them a bunch of Purina Omeline or some kind of sweet feed, and make them overweight as babies, and you set them up for life to have issues. We add lack of exercise into these already thrifty horses, and they get even thriftier. So maybe, and I've talked about this whole idea of letting them lose some weight in the wintertime, which is a much more natural cycle of what would be happening to these animals in nature, basically. We feed too much most of the time, or many of us feed too much. And even if we didn't feed too much, many times the horses were fed too much, either as babies or as young horses. You can go into some show barns, they think that having them round and fat makes them prettier, and they win more prizes if they're round and fat. Well, round, fat, and under stress for competition is a perfect setup for this whole PPID syndrome. And we're coming in and hitting the pancreas part of that sphere, another different part. We also we tend to fertilize fields with fertilizers that create rich grass, but it's very deficient because it's not, the proper mineral balance isn't there. And I have a webinar on grasses, so you can look that up. Most of our grasses that we grow in pastures are designed to make cows fat. So they make horses fat really easily, and they stress that pancreas system all the time. The picture up at the top really is where most horses are designed to live. You look out there, that doesn't look like a lot to eat, but many of those desert kind of plants are very high in protein, very high in nutrition, but they have to walk a long way to get to each one of them.
And Joyce, thinking of the grasses, and we're going to get there, but just the time of year too, the importance of.
Yeah, the time of year, the grasses change, the amount of sunshine, the grasses change. the amount of moisture. We can have a very dry year and we can have completely different moisture content, a completely different grass growth pattern. And we get caught out if we've lived on the same property for 3, 5, 10 years. We think we know what the grasses are doing, and then we have a year with all this weather change that's completely different. And all of a sudden we think, well, it's July, I can turn them out because we usually don't have any grass in July. And you have a July in which it's 70 degrees and rains every other day. And you basically have your spring grass. So you have your seasons of the year and you have your climate change. Sometimes we have green grass around here in February, not this year, but my grass turned green on March 1st. Just a little bit, but that's enough for some horses to set them off. So we also have soy products, which are in almost every single bag of food. And soy products are really not a good thing. Soy decreases thyroid function. Soy is estrogenic. It has a lot of estrogens in it. I think they found that soy-fed human babies had something like 30,000 times as much estrogen in them as regular breast milk-fed babies. So the research shows how it can decrease thyroid function, but what's thyroid? It's another hormone. So now we've got another place to come and hit this perfect sphere. So we start to mess it up from that direction. We also have a lot of genetically modified soybean. Most all of it is, unless it's very specifically organic or non-GMO, but it's very hard to get non-GMO soy. Most of the organic people use peas or hemp protein. And hemp protein is probably the most exciting source of protein that we can get. And that's becoming more and more readily available. Most of our ration balancers are very high in soy. So you can be feeding a cup of a ration balancer and actually be contributing to your insulin resistance, to your thyroid, and ultimately to your PPID. So back to your question about the seasons of the year, not only do we have our actual grass and carbohydrate intake, but we have these Chinese medicine aspects of the Chinese medicine aspects of life, if you will. So Chinese medicine has a great way of explaining things so that we can understand it from a different perspective. And in many ways, it's very good common sense. So we have spring, summer, fall, and winter, and they actually put sort of a fifth season as late summer. And that's kind of like the dog days of August when it's hot almost everywhere, even in Canada. And so you have 5 seasons and you have 5 elements, and you have wood, fire, water, and metal. And then you have a relationship between the seasons and the elements. And you also have a relationship between the personalities and the disorders that we get from the different seasons. So we'll do a webinar sometime on those 5 elements, and that'll be a lot of fun because you can see your horse's personality. So I'm not going to get into it in great depth, but springtime tends to be it's the season of wood. It is springtime, and wood is the liver acupuncture meridian. The liver acupuncture meridian is the stress meridian. So that's our cortisol meridian, and it responds to stress. So stress, confinement, competition. It's possible that more mares come up symptomatic with their laminitis in the spring, but I'm not sure that that holds 100% true. Mares have, versus geldings, the hormonal system is also controlled by the liver meridian. The liver meridian crosses the ovaries and the testicles, but we have so few stallions that we don't see that nearly as much. With the liver, if the liver is not able to if the liver is not able to move properly, then it is stressed. And so you get this stagnation, you get heat, and you can often get laminitis. And we'll go way more in depth into this in a future webinar. But the spring is going to be those horses that are stressed very often, that are more likely to have symptoms. The summer and fall, we have our earth kind of horses, probably the most common type. And these are our ones that are very, they get fat easily. So many of our Morgans, our quarter horses, our ponies, those are more likely, but not only, likely to have symptoms in the fall. And in the winter, our kidney meridian becomes important. And so a lot of our winter laminitis, you kind of wonder why you're seeing an aggravation, and that has to do with these deficiencies in the kidney meridian. So most of these are older. So I'm going to run quickly through some of the symptoms. Probably if you're listening to this, you have seen some of these symptoms in your horses. Your obesity, difficulty losing weight, this kind of cellulite or hard fat, lethargy, irritability. And it is possible that at this stage that they are only insulin resistant. Maybe they haven't turned completely into a PPID. And really a lot of the symptoms for PPID, or especially early stage, and insulin resistance are almost identical. And that's where our blood tests can kind of sort things out. As we get more advanced dysfunction of the pituitary gland, we can actually see underweight horses as well as overweight horses. We can have our laminitis. We can have a lot of muscle soreness, chronic infections. We have too much cortisol. Cortisol suppresses the immune system. And so we're more likely to see sinus infections, abscesses, and all kinds of stuff like that. Lethargy, excessive sweating or irregular sweating patterns. Some of them drink and pee a lot. And most of the horses are older than 15, but I certainly see it these days in the 10-year-old horses as well. And of course, laminitis, which we've done other webinars on, that's the worst sequela. That's the worst thing that can happen to us. One thing to watch out for is if you have a normal weight horse or pony, but you have fat pads up on the neck, you have a crusty neck, or you have fat pads by the tail. And if those start to get hard, that's that inflammation. That's that fat that is unhealthy, that is triggering all of this oxidative stress, and you are likely to get into trouble. The laboratory values, all of this will be available for download it'll be on the YouTube channel. And I'm not going to go into great detail with the laboratory values because I think you really rather know how you could treat this. But there are lots of different ways of looking at it. We can look at our insulin, we can look at our glucose. We often look at thyroid, but most of our thyroid tests are a single test, and we really need to look at a test that looks at the thyroid function all day long, like a salivary test. And then our ACTH, and I have plus or minus by there because the laboratory values are not cut and dried. They are not one. We can have lots of symptoms and low numbers. We can have not very many symptoms and have really high numbers. And we can have both insulin and ACTH high. Lately, they have been doing a stimulation test, so your vet will give a little shot of this TRH, and then measured your ACTH after that. And if that jumps way up, then it means that your cortisol and ACTH function is not as good.
And one quick question, Joyce, time of year, like when with Tessa, I've experienced, when's the best time to do it to find out?
That's a good question, because it's become very clear lately that the fall season, really starting early August all the way through October, November, depending on exactly what research you're looking at, the ACTH levels go up. And some horses have their aggravation at that time of year, like Tessa does. And other horses they just have a higher than normal level, even if they are normal horses. So if you're testing in that August through, I really go through November, then you have to be aware that the levels are going to be higher, and you don't need to jump on panic mode just because your levels are a little bit higher if you're doing this in September. So we're going to start talking a little bit more about treatment. And the one drug that we have to treat this with is our pergolide or Prosend. And that's the only drug that the drug people have. We have lots of herbs, we have lots of different choices, but that acts on the receptors in the pituitary gland. It's supposed to suppress that tissue enlargement and give us less ACTH production, and consequently fewer clinical signs. And in some horses, that is true, and it can be a useful drug to get through a crisis. And for some horses, we end up needing to use it. For most horses, we don't. This is the reason why we don't. This is a rough drug. It was taken off the market, off the human market. And horses lose their appetite. They become more and more unhappy. They become grumpy. They become just unpleasant horses because they don't feel well. I think they get headaches from it. Their stomach is definitely upset by it. And yet there are some that are totally fine and that actually feel better. As soon as you bring that ACTH level down, they will thrive on it. And I'm okay with that if that's really working for them. But for most of them, it's really not so okay. So as we talked about with Chinese medicine, is the imbalances that occur in those patterns that we briefly talked about. The theories go along with the seasons of the year and all of those kinds of imbalances, and we have combinations. And in Chinese medicine, if you do a telephone consult with me or another Chinese medicine practitioner, we're going to have you look at the color of the tongue and how much moisture is on the tongue, because that can tell us if there's too much heat in the body, if there's too much cold in the body, if there's not enough chi or energy, and it helps us prescribe much better. So the best part, really, we saved that for last, but I think if you understand what's happening, it's easier to make decisions about your horse's lifestyle, and health and feeding all the way along. So the important thing is, if you have PPID horses, because of that whole insulin involvement, even if they're not insulin resistant, there's insulin involved in it. We generally want to reduce our carbohydrates, reduce our sugars, and reduce our grasses, depending on the individual horse. The difficult thing with PPID is that there is not one prescription that I can say, you do this and your PPID horse will be better. And anybody that promises you that is selling you something, because these horses are extremely variable in their presentation and extremely variable in their response and their ability to respond. So we can test hay, we can use muzzles, The best thing is to feed whole feeds, and in many cases to just eliminate grains totally and just feed Timothy pellets. That can be a great feed substitute, something simple. Our leaky gut, which is our gut health, is really important. And I do have a whole webinar on probiotics, so I'm not going to get into the details of that, but the gut and the brain have a physical connection. The gut has a huge connection to our immune system. So remember, we said that the cortisol can suppress the immune system. So we need to take care of that gut. And genetically modified feeds create inflammation in the gut. Essential fatty acids, healthy for insulin resistance, but also PPID. I forgot to put that on this slide. Essential fatty acids, those are antioxidants. They help with insulin resistance, all kinds of things, a lot of minerals. Antioxidants, many, many different antioxidants we can use. We can also treat the symptoms with herbs. We can treat the symptoms homeopathically. And think about stress. Think about the whole environment that you're keeping them in. So for feeding, removing the sugar, Speedy Beet is a non-GMO beet pulp that can be a useful way to get some food into them. I use a lot of hay pellets. Feed a lot of vegetables. Open up your refrigerator and look at what's about to expire and see what your horse is like. Not the high sugar veggies, but the nice greens and low carb veggies. There's lots of low carb treats. I love the Hilton Herbs herb balls. My horses love them. My dog loves them too. We can use muzzles to control feed intake and let horses go out. I've got muzzles that are much more comfortable for horses to wear. And there's new designs coming out all the time. Flax, hemp, and chia seeds are all excellent sources with antioxidants in them. You can, if you have a horse that's underweight, instead of feeding a whole bunch of grain and carbohydrates, feed high fat or high protein, preferably like a hemp protein diet. And you can feed low sugar hay if you can get it. Exercise is always wonderful. Are we all out riding our horses stuff? So, we can't always do that in our lifestyles. And if we have laminitis present, it's even harder. So we can set up a pasture paradise type of situation, which my friend Wendy Murdoch has done here on my farm. And our horses are now galloping to the water and galloping back from the water. I've been doing it for about 6 months, and it's being really effective at exercising when I'm not out there doing it. So feeding, you want to try and control your feeding. And quite honestly, if you're in a boarding barn, sometimes that's difficult. And people just can't say your horse only gets a handful of grain. So you have to do the best that you can do. Muzzling, I've already mentioned. Minerals are something that all of these PPID and insulin resistant horses really seem to need more of. Magnesium is talked about a lot, and magnesium is important, but trace minerals are as well. And if you mix your minerals with salt, then the salt will limit how much they take in. So I use a lot of Rush Creek minerals that doesn't have salt, and then I put salt next to it. Essential fatty acids, I had mentioned, they are antioxidant, insulin metabolism. They increase fat burning in the liver as well. So that's our flax and hemp and chia seeds. Usually 3 to 6 ounces of oil, 6 to 8 ounces of the meal, flax meal or flax seed. Only use ground flax if you grind it, feed it, or if it's naturally stabilized when it's ground. Otherwise, use your horse's teeth. Works much better. And it's much easier. OB and INR are two formulas that are on the website that I created using a lot of the human research. Humans don't, I think, Steph, we were talking a little bit earlier about the idea of Cushing's disease in humans and dogs, because you hear
Right.
that talked about. And those are different diseases than the PPID that we have in horses. So taking some of the research from the human, not so much human Cushing's and dog Cushing's, but taking research from the cortisol metabolism issues that people have and applying it to the issues that horses have is the basis for these two formulas. The OB is for your average kind of a fat, heavy horse, but it's not directed directly towards the ACTH. You still may have to do something different to address the ACTH aspect, but this will help the insulin resistant aspect. The INR has higher levels, but it also has got some herbs for detoxification, antioxidants that will help the PPID horses a little bit more. Antioxidants, there are so many out there, and there are mushrooms out there with antioxidant properties. I've just put a couple of them up here that I use a lot. Coenzyme Q10, which has a lot of cardiovascular or vascular effects, because the horse's foot is really where we see, in humans, we have heart attacks. Horses don't have heart attacks. They have issues with the circulation in the feet with laminitis. And so coenzyme Q10 really can make a huge difference. Vitamin C, great antioxidant. Vitamin E, a lot of our horses are deficient in vitamin E, especially these ones that we can't turn out on grass. So vitamin C and vitamin E often go together and work very well. And those are also relatively inexpensive antioxidants. Some of them, like resveratrol, can get very, very expensive. So you can do a huge amount of good with your vitamin C and some vitamin E. Our omega-3 fatty acids we've talked about a couple of times. And these are a couple of the acupuncture meridians, which we don't need to get into today. And these food things, where there's an article on my website about food therapy. So if we need to add grain to a horse that's already got some inflammation, but we also they have got to help get some food into them to gain weight, then we can actually use things like barley, because barley is a cooling grain. It is a carbohydrate, but it is cooling and it's better tolerated by some of these horses that have a lot of inflammation. Again, raid your refrigerator, and you can grow vegetables in your garden. And you can use warming foods if the issue is that your horse is too cool. So we have oats and quinoa that are both quite warming in the grain department. And then our warming vegetables. Tons of Western herbal formulas for treatment. And this is just a tiny list. And to get into the treatment aspect, though, I find that many of these horses need to be individually treated to determine what they really need. So one of my favorite general formulas is the Vitex Plus by Hilton Herbs. There are a lot of people that feed Vitex by itself because it's a very good herb for regulating the pituitary gland. But many herbs really work best in a combination. There's the synergy of all of these herbs together balancing each other out. So I tend to use more formulas than single herbs. But these are a couple of common herbs that you'll see in formulas. The one that I want to talk a little bit about is cinnamon, because cinnamon is in almost every insulin resistant formula that you will see out there, because there's a little bit of research that shows that it does help insulin resistance. Cinnamon is a warming herb. So if you're already warm inside, and many of our younger horses are too warm inside, cinnamon actually over time aggravates the problem. So we really, for many horses, we need a neutral or even a cooling formula. And these horses that are sweating irregularly or sweating too much, the last thing in the world you want to add to them is cinnamon. So really watch your supplements carefully for that and make sure that it's appropriate for your horse. The other one that's coming more and more talked about is not directly affecting the pituitary gland, at least we don't know whether it is yet or not, but for many of the antioxidant, the anti-inflammatory properties, CBD or hemp is being incorporated, and I'm adding that into some of my treatments because it makes the horses more comfortable. It reduces the inflammation, and as soon as we reduce the inflammation in the fat, then we are slowing down that oxidative stress that we talked about way back at the beginning. Homeopathics are something that there are lots of ways to use homeopathy very simply for acute problems. Homeopathic remedies in PPID horses really need to be prescribed constitutionally by somebody that understands homeopathy, because we're dealing with a long-term chronic condition and we're looking for a long-term response. I find it a very important part of what I do, but there's probably 25 remedies that I use commonly, and then in some horses even more. I branch out farther from that common list of 25. So you don't want to just start throwing remedies at your horses unless you're working with somebody or you really understand homeopathy at the constitutional level. So, do you feel like that, Panda Bear?
Huh?
I do. Just trying to get through all of this science and information and stuff like that this is a long, in-depth webinar, but we need to understand what's really happening. This is a complex condition, and we need to keep studying it and keep learning and not give up, because we can help these guys.
Awesome. And actually, we have a couple great questions I'd like to ask you.
Yes.
Karen wants to know, can insulin resistance trigger PPID?
Yes, in the sense, if we kind of go back to our pathways, we have that sphere, and so we start over here with overfeeding or genetics on the insulin part. Well, grandma sitting out here has to start working and overworking. And with the insulin resistance, we get those inflammatory fat pads that start that oxidative oxidative process, that rusting process. So we can come in from the insulin side, we can come in from the thyroid side, we can come in from the pituitary side, we can come in from almost any part of that and mess up our sphere and end up in the PPID department as the horse ages.
Have you seen a connection between PPID and I don't know what these are, RAO and IAD?
Reactive airway disease and inflammatory airway disease.
Okay.
And I know there's one company out there that sort of talks about those are always linked. I do not find that they are necessarily linked at all, but you will see some horses that have both. And you have to remember that, or understand that reactive airway disease, or whatever the acronym, COPD, HEAVES, all of those things are terms for the same issue, which is an allergic lung condition. But allergies are part of the immune system. So if our immune system is being adversely affected by having too much cortisol, it is not a stretch to say that that certain individuals are going to start to have immune overreactions because their immune system is totally messed up because of that. The high cortisol all the time is affecting that immune system. And so some horses have a chronic infection, like a sinus infection. Other horses go in the allergic department, towards the allergies department. And there are times that as you're treating one condition, the other one is getting better. And that's because there's a lot of connections. And there are also a bunch of these little tiny hormones that I can't even pronounce the names of, that interrelate with the lung system and the immune system in the lungs, and that are part of this whole pituitary grandmother system.
Cool. From Karen P, I've seen some good inflammation symptom reduction with, is it camelina oil? We'll be redoing blood work this spring. Do you have any information or experience with it? And that's CAMELINA.
Camelina oil is one of the good oils that's out there. So you can use that in place of hemp or flax or chia seeds. You're going to have better omega-3 balances in camelina oil. The oils that are really bad are your soybean and corn that are really high in the omega-6s. Rice bran oil it can be a good source of fat if you need calories, but it isn't particularly high in omega-3s. It's the omega-3s that really benefit us.
She also asks, and I did have my hay tested, any recommendations on where to get the hay tested and what tests to have performed? I can't remember the name of the group where you...
Equa Analytical.
Okay.
Is the name of the lab. If you type that in, Equa Analytical. I think there's a dash in the middle of the after Equa.
Okay.
But if you just type Equa Analytical into your browser, you'll get it. Mm-hmm. And there you get interpretation of the carbohydrate content of the hays. And that website also has years, you have to dig around, but it has years worth of data that shows you averages and sort of means and standard deviations and all kinds of data on hay that they've collected over the years. So you can learn a lot. You know, people will say, well, this cutting of this type of hay is always good. No, if that cutting of that type of hay was cut on a hot, sunny summer afternoon, it's still going to be higher in sugar. That same type of hay cut on a cloudy morning at 10 o'clock might be very low in sugar.
And they were great to talk to because I wasn't sure I didn't have the hay probe and all that stuff. So she told me how to do it. And so give them a call. Yeah, if you have any questions, they're great. Now that we're talking hays, what are the lowest sugar varieties of grasses? Hay.
There's actually, I did a whole webinar on grasses and hay feeding. And the problem is that there is no one hay that you can say is always lower because it goes back to the harvest conditions. So right. People will say that teff hay is low in carbohydrates, but if it's cut on a sunny afternoon, You look on that Equa Analytical site, they have some TEF-Hays that came in with very high carbohydrate contents, sugar contents. It has a tendency to be lower. And the grasses in your area, to find out for your particular area, because each part of the country grows different kinds of grasses, talk to your county extension agents. They still are not always as versed in what horses need in the sense of low carbohydrate grasses. Your warm season summer grasses, things like little blue stem, tend to be much lower in carbohydrates, but they don't make great pasture grasses because they get broken up too easily. So your local county extension agent can give you a hand with what grows best locally and low.
Sue is asking, what dose of CBD for a 1,000-pound horse?
Usually, if you're using the high quality CBD from our sponsors, the high quality in general, you really only need to start around 25 milligrams twice a day. Some horses, individuals, you can increase that dose. You can go to 30 to 40, even sometimes 50 milligrams. Most of the time, you don't need to go any higher to see a good response. And I've seen some companies coming out with very high numbers. And I'm not quite sure what they're doing with their CBD or what their actual quality of CBD is, because most horses respond very well at lower doses. And that's true with most herbs. Most horses only eat 2, maybe 3 times a human dose. And the human dose on CBD is anywhere from 10 to 20 milligrams usually. And again, it can go up and it can get very high if needed. But most of the time, people see responses at the lower doses. So it's very logical for a horse to respond well at 25 to 50, except in odd individuals that need more because of their degree of symptoms.
And we have a student of herbalism with a veterinary background. Can you recommend any equine herbal reference books or sites? And you may have that on your website, don't you?
Yes, we should have Stacy Small's equine. Let me pull it off the shelf. Equine Herbal and Energetics. And Stacy Small, Andrea Baldwin. This is an excellent reference book. And then Hillary Self's, this is an older book that's been around for a while. And Modern Horse Herbal, and she's got a Veteran Horse Herbal as well. Those are probably the two. The real Bible right now is the Stacy Small book. And I believe that the Hilton Herb people, Hillary Self, are working on some updated books as well. But you'll get a tremendous amount of information out of those.
Fabulous. Which test, and it may be a phone call, which test for the hay, the Equa Analytical, provides the information that she'd be looking for? Is that going to the website and
going to the website? Yeah, because what you want is you want the tests that are going to show your sugar content, your soluble sugar content, and I can't remember the exact name of the tests that are on there, but it's fairly obvious, and you can call them up and if you're confused about the name of the individual test.
Great. And I'm not sure if this is for the Cushing's. Dr. Joyce, what are your thoughts of Summit Joint Performance, chondroitin sulfate? Is that?
There is that particular product I'm not sure about, but off the top of my head, but there has been some concern about feeding like glucosamine because it is a sugar molecule to horses with insulin resistance or PPID. And I would say that most of the time it seems to be okay, but there definitely are some horses that I have had to take off of a glucosamine type of supplement and use something like hyaluronic acid. This is a great place to use some CBD because you get it completely away from that sugar molecule.
Great. And is it Karen? Someone asked about what kind of salt. Do you remember when you were talking about the salt?
Salt, basically you want a free choice, naturally mined salt. You can use a sea salt, you can use a Redmond type salt. Horses don't have really coarse tongues, and so they actually do better with a loose salt so that they can eat as much as they want. But most horses don't eat a ton of salt. So if your horse is not a big salt eater, one of the Himalayan salts, having that available in the stall is fine. You just want a salt source for them to have the option to take in salt.
Great. And that looks like it. We
Great.
ran a little bit long, but thanks everybody. I mean, I learned every time too, even though I had an hour consult with Dr. Harman earlier today on Cushing's and everything. So thank you. We really appreciate it. Y'all for joining us, and Joyce for your expertise. And thank you to Docs Hemp for sponsoring us. Stay healthy and safe out there, guys. And we hope you'll join us next month for another webinar with Dr. Harman.
Great, thanks for coming, and look forward to spring and getting out and exercising those beasts.
Yes.